I simply can't wait till next spring to start sowing seeds, so I'm starting now in November. And I'm going to be starting by using the winter sowing method. So for all of you who don't have a greenhouse out there, don't despair. You can still sow now using this method. And then I'm going to talk about the method, and then I'm also going to run through some of the seeds that are brilliant to start using this method and that will overwinter to get a head start on spring. So what is winter sowing? Well, winter sowing is basically a well-known and well-established method of sowing seeds in sort of plastic or transparent containers, such as milk jugs, salad containers, water bottles, which is what I use, water bottles, and then leaving them outdoors in the winter to do whatever they do during the winter period. This process allows the seeds to naturally experience the winter and the outdoor winter conditions, which they would experience in the wild, of course, but in a more kind of contained and measured environment. So, for instance, scattering seeds in the garden, you can't monitor them that way. You cannot monitor them because you can't remember where you put them. You end up digging them up, the dogs dig them up, the birds eat them. If you have them all contained in bottles or in milk jugs, put them in a corner of your garden, then you can monitor them. You know exactly where they are and whether they are growing or not. So that's why we do it. It also means that they're protected from other pests and diseases. Pests really, such as slugs, and also the worst of the weather. So as I say, it's like a little mini greenhouse. And because it's like a little mini greenhouse, of course, it's going to get warmer sooner in the spring. And so your plants are going to start a bit earlier, which gives you an advantage. Now, if you do have a greenhouse, you can do all these seeds that I'm going to mention in a greenhouse and overwinter them as well. I do both methods because I like to experiment and see what works best for you lot. And also, I don't like to fill up my greenhouse with everything, so I have to have other options. And I have spare space in my garden for putting these bottles where I can just forget about them. So why do I start them in November? Well, truly, you can start them, I think of treating them like bulbs just before, really the end of November is probably a cut-off in my zone. You can start them earlier if you have a very cool autumn. I did start some in September last year, but that was just way too hot and they bolted. They did germinate prior to the spring and they bolted. Now, if they do germinate prior to spring, that's fine. They will survive light frosts. That's the whole point. They are hardy. But we don't necessarily want them to germinate. We don't care if we germinate. Germinate is not the indicator of whether this is working, because a lot of these seeds that are going to overwinter in this method actually do benefit from a period of cold, what they call cold stratification. It's like with a bulb, you put it under the soil. The darkness and the wet of autumn encourages it to grow lovely roots, and then the cold just chills it and it gives it that tells it it's winter. And then of course, as the temperatures and the light starts to improve in spring, the bulb, as each day in the winter, as the lights get longer and stronger and brighter and the days get warmer, then the shoots start to grow. And that's exactly the same process that you have with seeds. So the reason for starting them now is the same reason you start bulbs now, is to give them the benefit of all those natural processes so that they are ready, so that the seed is conditioned correctly to germinate in spring. Many seeds that you just get straight out of the packet won't have had the cold stratification period, and they won't have got softened and got wet, as they would outside in the soil in the natural conditions. So that is why we do them now, even if they're not going to germinate. Now, for those that do germinate, that's not a problem either. They will survive in this method if they are hardy in your zone. Then some frost and cold and winter is not going to harm them, so don't worry about that. Even if you've got, say for instance, something like a yarrow and it germinated, the root wouldn't die, so it would still come back stronger in the spring. So that's why this is a really great method for either hardy annuals or hardy perennials. And that's why, it just keeps the momentum up in the garden, keeps you interested, gets you sowing again, because there's nothing better than sowing seeds, let's face it, when you're gardening. So that's why I'm sowing them in November. But as I say, you can sow them in October. Depends where you are. I wouldn't sow them in December because you're starting already to get into the frost. So October, November, September's probably too warm. September's okay for outside if you're growing them outside, but not the winter sowing method. They will get too leggy. So a brief overview of how you do the winter sowing method. So you take your container, your milk jug, your water bottle, whatever, and you cut it about 1/3 through, not all the way round, and then you poke drainage holes in the bottom. Take the lid off as well, because we want the rain and the snow and the elements and the moisture, and we want it to be able to breathe. So we take the lid off. Then on the bottom third, obviously we pack with a compost, which I do about probably 1/3 to 2/3 or half of good quality compost with sand for good drainage. And you need that soil to be really open for when those tiny little baby seeds start to grow. They can't grow through a hard concrete soil. That's why we add the sand, keeps it loose and open. So then you pack that in. Well, not pack it in. Actually, it's better if the compost is moist before you put it in, so good and wet. Then you add the seeds, however they're sown. Some will need to be sown under cover. Some will prefer to be sown on the surface of the compost. So you'll need to check your growing instructions for the choices of seed that you make. And then once you've done all that, you close the lid off, the top half, you put the top half back on the bottle, and then you seal it with tape. And I use sellotape and it lasts perfectly well. So you don't need to go and buy anything fancy or a speciality tape. The other thing I forgot to mention is also put on, obviously, the seed. You put a label of the seed, and I like to put the date of when I sowed it so that I can then, keep a record for future records of what I was doing when and how it worked out. Now, sometimes seeds won't germinate, and that might not necessarily be the process of the winter sowing method. I found that a lot. Sometimes you just get duff seeds. So I would suggest sowing a variety of things in this method, and then you can see, your general levels of success rather than depending on one particular seed. So if you have, say, for instance, 5 varieties of seed germinate and one doesn't, it could just be that those seeds were a bad batch. And then by having some successes, you'll be more motivated to continue gardening and growing things from seed. So don't just do kind of one seed this way, because if that seed is duff, and there are seed packets that are duff, they've been in the shop too long, they've gone stale, they haven't been stored correctly. So I'd have a go at a few seeds just to see how you get on with the process. Now, I started these sweet peas a couple of weeks ago, and you can see how well they're doing in this method already, and these should be good to overwinter. I have done them, I have overwintered them before. Now, if you want more information on sweet peas, obviously I have a lengthy video on that. I have a sweet pea masterclass, and I'll link that below if you specifically want to dive in deep to sweet peas. So aside from sweet peas, there are lots of other hardy annuals and hardy perennials that you can grow using this method. And frankly, if I don't mention any that you fancy growing, just check on the packet and see if it's a hardy annual or a hardy perennial. And if it doesn't say on the packet, Google it. And if it says it's hardy, then you can grow it using this method. Okay, so we're going to list the hardy annuals first, and we've already mentioned sweet peas, which are a hardy annual, so let's move on from there. Snapdragons are another one I found overwinter really well. Larkspur, delphiniums, calendula, nigella, bachelor's buttons, gypsophilia, honeywort. Some varieties of poppies are hardy annuals. For those who like Orlea as a cut flower, that is also a hardy annual. Catnip is a hardy annual. Anyway, the list goes on. As I say, just look for hardy annuals. And then some of the hardy perennials that I've grown or that I personally recommend growing through this way are as follows: Rudbeckia, Black-Eyed Susan, more commonly known as coneflower, which is also Echinacea. Yarrow is an excellent one for beginners because it's just almost foolproof. Anyone can grow it. Lupins, of course, would be good to do now, ready for flowering in late spring, early summer next year. Columbine, Aquilegia, Granny's bonnet, some people call it. Shasta daisy is another hardy perennial that you can do now, and is just a real solid plant for the garden in summer. I mean, it just flowers and flowers and flowers, and the clump gets bigger every year. So I've talked about Shasta daisies in other videos. So you can divide the clump, so you you just keep getting more and more out of a Shasta daisy. So again, if you're a beginner, if you've got a new garden, you're looking to fill it with flowers, I definitely recommend growing some Shasta daisies. Russian sage is another one I should grow. I haven't grown it. I grew it in my Brighton garden, but I haven't grown it in this garden. I just keep forgetting about it. But that's another one I could do with growing. Coreopsis is another one that is a great perennial for overwintering. So again, like the others, you'll get more and more each year. Penstemon is another one, which is kind of nice, like the foxglove. You get those nice tall stems with the bell-like flowers on. And another one that's tall like that is the verbascum, which I grow as a beautiful little cottage garden flower. That's another one that will overwinter fine. You could start that now, definitely. And it's super pretty, that one. I love it. It's a real cottage garden plant, verbascum. And then, you know, things like catmint, gypsophilia, Baptisia is another one. Sea holly, bee balm is a great one for growing in the garden because it smells great. The bees love it. It really fills up a nice big space, and it will obviously come back the next year, providing you don't dig it up like I did with mine. And it just smells great. I think that the smell of that one for me is the winner. And I don't know if I mentioned it, but also with hardy annuals, bells of Ireland, I think I said to grow that one. And don't forget, there's also hardy annual and hardy perennial vegetables and herbs that you can look into growing, such as parsley, rocket, and then you've got the asparagus and things like that. I will do a separate video on growing the veg and salad that I'm going to grow. So that's what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be sowing most of those I've mentioned in this video, and I'm going to leave mine out on the drive. So you want to leave them in a place that gets some sunlight, but that's not bombarded with sunlight, strong sunlight all day, because it's going to be too hot inside those bottles. So, and you can put them somewhere out of the way. You don't need to have to be able to see them. I like to sort of hide them on my drive or behind my greenhouse, but somewhere where they're also accessible, because you want to keep an eye on them. Likelihood they're not going to do much now. Some may, as I said, germinate, but lots will not germinate until next spring. And another thing, when you're looking at them, as the days start to lengthen and warm, the other side of Christmas, some of them will germinate sooner rather than others. So for instance, one of the ones that takes the longest for me to see results with is the bells of Ireland. So don't give up. Sometimes the bells of Ireland literally don't even start growing until, you know, my others are almost fully mature. So you do have to bear that in mind. Each seed has its own pace and its own unique conditions for stimulating growth, such as temperature, levels of light, precipitation, warmth, humidity. All these different things stimulate the seed to grow. So don't expect them all to germinate at the same time. If you're obviously, if you're not a beginner, you already know that. But if you're a beginner, sometimes there's a temptation to think, oh, I failed, and you throw them out. And I almost did that with my bells of Ireland the first year. But I didn't get around to it. I'm sort of not very good at throwing things out and tidying up and everything. And blow me down, it was a good job, because my bells of Ireland did in fact germinate much, much later than the others when I'd given up on them. And they actually did produce me then some absolutely beautiful flowers in the summer. So that's another job you can be doing then now. So you're doing your bulbs and you can be doing your growing. It just gives you, I think, having something to look forward to is always really good to get you through the dark days of winter. Obviously, most people love Christmas and look forward to that. But for me, Christmas is a bit of a chore. I need something for myself to look forward to. And for me, that is growing seeds, because then I get to have beautiful flowers, beautiful salad crops and herbs and everything else the following summer. So there you go. Feel inspired to grow. And if you do, please subscribe and like and share my video with friends, etc. And I'll see you again in my next video. Thanks for watching. Bye.